It's 2007. You're browsing this newfangled site called YouTube, watching the dumbest videos in 240p. And among those videos of unicorns named Charlie, dramatic rodents, and anime AMVs synced to Linkin Park, there's always one line that you come across. Something that you just couldn't escape in late 2000s pop culture. This is... 300 is a fascinating film. Even though it wasn't the biggest movie of the year, you could not escape it. It's something that's been kind of forgotten to time, only left preserved in old YouTube videos made in Flash and Windows Movie Maker. It was a concoction of energy that couldn't help but be parodied. 300 is based on a comic by Frank Miller. Get out of my house! You either know who he is, or you don't. He's been in the comic industry for decades. In 1997, he made a limited series called 300, based loosely on the ancient Battle of Thermopylae. Keyword here is loosely. Sorry if you came here expecting some comparison between 300 and the real battle, like a historical CinemaSins or something. This isn't that type of video. By this point, I'd assume most people understand this isn't accurate at all. If this is the first time you're hearing about this, then wow, I'm sorry man, read a book or something. No, the Persians didn't fight with giant trollmen or bladed demons. Xerxes wasn't an 8-foot-tall demigod. The Immortals weren't evil goblins. They looked like this. And the Spartans wore armor, not just leather underwear. 300 is first and foremost a fantasy, as fantastical as Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones. All of these were purposeful creative decisions by the movie or Miller himself. And if we want to understand the movie, we're gonna have to do the one thing that nobody ever does when talking about 300. Let's talk about the comic. When Frank Miller was a wee lad, he watched a film called The 300 Spartans.
Here we stay. And here we stand. For how long? Until we win!
You could say he was a fan. He said in an interview that it changed the course of his creative life. I tried to get more information on what that meant, but any link to that interview is dead. So that sucks. I also caught COVID in between recordings, so I sound like this now. So that double sucks. Gonna have to just take Wikipedia at its word. After watching the 300 Spartans and coughing my brain out, you know, I could see how it'd have some influence. It's kind of funny how tame the depiction of the Persians are compared to 300. It's like night and day. The 300 Spartans is a pretty solid movie, but just like a lot of films of the time, it's more sanitized than Mr. Clean.
Hey, this is a really good war. They say Xerxes has brought 100 nations with him.
The Spartans get along with everyone. They're like the loyal vanguard of united Greece. So in 300, the Spartans were now rough and brutal. They killed babies. The aspect of their almost psychotic devotion to militarism is on full display. They're still noble, but not in that clean-cut 1960s way. They look like they've seen 1,000 battles. Their superiority complex is cranked up to 11. The only thing Miller didn't include was the Spartans' rampant use of slavery, which by his admittance he knew happened, he just didn't want people to completely hate them. Personally, I think he should have went all the way. Release the slavery cut, Miller. The actual comic is so short though, I don't know where he'd fit it in. The politics of this world really don't matter. It's just minor set dressing. The story is just a band of soldiers marching to a place, fighting for a little bit, and then dying. The end. And it's fantastic. George Miller's angular style really elevates the story in a way that the movie just can't. They're like angular, muscular cavemen. These faces are brutish and tired. It isn't until they put on the helmet and line up in formation where any semblance of Spartan glory actually appears. The comic's just full of striking silhouettes. Like for instance, Xerxes. Why does he look like that? Well, in the comic, the main aspect of his design are those chains. He isn't even really drawn a lot. He's more like a negative space illuminated by gold. No, it's not accurate, but it is surreal. And that's what I'd describe the comic as. One that's attempting to be a stark difference from the clean movie that inspired Miller in the first place. And while I do like what the movie does, I can't help but feel after reading the comic that some aspects were just lost in translation. But that's just the nature of live action. Which, oh hey, I should probably talk about the movie now. 300 the movie is always just compared to the actual historical battle itself. But like, 300 is first and foremost an adaptation of a comic. A comic inspired by a 1960s movie, loosely inspired by at least a few centuries of interpretation on a battle with a lot of historical baggage. A long game of telephone adaptation. And this movie does have a lot of baggage attached to it. There are some controversial elements that can't be left unsaid. We have to talk about something this movie has perpetuated since it first came out in 2007.
Zack Snyder!
Oh boy, Zack Snyder. He had done one movie before 300, the remake of Dawn of the Dead, which was apparently written by James Gunn. I didn't know that. 300 was going to be the first film where his recognizable style could really blossom, an opportunity for his cocoon to crack, and a Zack Snyder butterfly to finally come out. What the fuck is this analogy? If I could describe Zack Snyder in a single word, I would describe him as pure. Look at that man. Not a single thought is going on in that head. And that's why we love him. That's right, this is a Zack Snyder friendly space. He is very much a visual person. Like 90% of his brain is made up of stylish cinematography, and the other 10% is color grading. Today, the name Zack Snyder cracks open the earth beneath internet nerds' feet, and I just find that hilarious. There's just something about this man that makes people lose their minds. Probably the decade or so of questionable films.
Why did you say that name?
Snyder's relationship with WB is an epic as fascinating as the Greek poems themselves. You could say it would eventually encompass the entire studio, maybe even Hollywood in general. I'm not gonna say a word about the DCEU, but I will say that everything going on with this can be traced back to this, with a funny little man who just wanted to bring a funny little comic to life. Literally. If you watch the movie, you have basically read the comic. Shots, entire lines.
Ready your breakfast and eat hearty. But tonight, we dine in hell!
Most of the script ripped right out of the comic. Snyder loved it so darn much, he did everything to change it as little as possible. Like as little as possible. Panels from the comic were used as storyboard references, and shots were built directly from that. And honestly, who can blame him? The comic looked good, and Snyder knew that. And then he went on to do the same thing with Watchmen. Unlike that movie, 300 was really the perfect project for him to get his hands on. It was a simple story that lent itself to exaggeration, hyper-violence, and most importantly, style. Truly, the peak Snyder film. 300 is officially called an American epic historical action film, but I think its true genre should just be called fuck yeah, because that's really the main emotion this movie tries to evoke. Fuck yeah, hell yeah, hot damn, oorah. This is the definition of a power fantasy. And that's all Zack Snyder thought while directing it. How do I make this look as cool as possible, and also how do I make this as faithful to the comic as possible? There is an overuse of bloom and sepia tones, all meant to evoke the often bright backgrounds of the original panels. 300 is a world of computer-generated backgrounds, slow motion, more filters than a TikTok livestream, and a truly banger soundtrack. And in my humble opinion, I think it works. You know, in that caveman brain sense. Meat, cigar, Tim Allen grunt. Yeah, in a decade this movie is not visibly aged great. It's very clearly all shot on green screens, and you could argue the entire visual language of this movie has been made fun of to death. But to me, this has only enhanced the experience. No movie has ever looked like this again, nor would it ever dare to. The closest comparison I could possibly make is Spy Kids 3D. Cake. And I say that as a compliment. That's a compliment. 300 at its core is an ancient horde game mode. This goes on for about 3 days until the Spartans are betrayed by Quasimodo and they're gunned down in the streets. There are no character arcs in 300. Character arcs are for the weak, but there are characters, or as best as characters as there could be. There are faces, separate faces, so let's talk about those faces.
Leonidas.
King Leo. the big cheese, the meme himself. Leonidas is the best part of this movie, and I didn't need to tell you that. In the greater pop culture sphere, Leonidas is really remembered for those bombastic moments. And those moments rock. Such raw anger and drive in each line. It sounds both incredibly badass and also unintentionally hilarious. And that's what 300 is all about. That's what we're fighting for. Yet as famous as this line was, nobody ever knew what the hell this giant hole was. Why did they have this here? Seems a little dangerous. It's a well. It's meant to be a well. In the histories, the Greeks really did kill their Persian diplomats, and the Spartans threw theirs down a well. In true 300 fashion, this is exaggerated as much as possible. It's actually kind of funny how many of the most badass lines in this fantasy movie were said to have actually happened.
Lay down your weapons! Come and get them!
Even inspired a certain flag that if you're Texan, you're probably familiar with. Or even this exchange.
Our arrows will blot out the sun.
Then we will fight in the shade.
That line actually came straight from the 60s movie.
Our arrows will blot out the sun. Then we will fight in the shade.
But it was something Leonidas said to one of his own men, not a Persian. But while old Leo does a lot of the screaming throughout the movie, he has another side too, which I entirely forgot about until rewatching it. He's usually just a smartass.
Slaughtering all those men of yours has left a nasty cramp in my leg, so...
Gerard Butler does a lot with a few facial expressions and head tilts, never breaking that Spartan emotional wall. I couldn't fit this in anywhere, but I was listening to the 300 commentary, and Zack Snyder kept referring to Gerard Butler as Jerry.
And Jerry looks like he's in pretty good shape in that shot right there.
And I thought that was the funniest thing ever. All hail Jerry, king of the Spartans.
Other Spartans.
Who knew Michael Fassbender was in this? I don't remember that. He looks pretty hilarious.
We are with you, sire! For Sparta! For freedom! To the death!
Despite there being 300 Spartans, they only focus on like 4. There's a father and son pair, Leonidas' second in command, literally just named Captain, who brings along his oldest son named Astinos, a name that is not Greek. The Greek historian who was working on the movie wondered where the hell Snyder got that name from, and Snyder said he named him after his Aston Martin. That's incredible. Poor Aston Martin. And then there's Dilios, the only surviving Spartan of the 300, sent by Leonidas to tell their story to the rest of Greece. And Dilios, he sure does. Even the parts where he wasn't even there. Did Dilios make up the fact that Leonidas' last thought was of his wife? Who's to say? He probably made up a bunch of things. He's got an active imagination. If you really want to think about it, 300's kind of just from Dilios' imagination. I really want to know what the rest of the ancient world looks like from his perspective. What are the Gauls like in the 300 world? Are they giant, monstrous gingers? Are the Egyptians cat people? Maybe the Scythians of the Eurasian steppe are literal centaurs. Call me WB, I have ideas. Now, I haven't watched 300 in a while, so while watching this, I thought, man, Dilios' voice is really familiar. Where have I heard that before? And then it clicked.
From the time he could stand, he was baptized in the fire of combat.
Long I pondered my king's cryptic talk of victory.
Combat Engine was created by Robert Daly, a former Green Beret and designer of more than 30 military-based video games.
He's the narrator of Deadliest Warrior. Hell yeah, it's all connected, baby. Honestly, it makes sense. I would imagine that 300 and Deadliest Warrior had a pretty big overlap. Hell, I wouldn't be shocked if 300 inspired Deadliest Warrior.
Monuments, no poems of war and valor.
Designer of more than 30 military-based video games.
Speaking of historical inaccuracy, I feel like there's something else. Something I've been putting off. Oh yeah. Ooh. Yeah, the Persians. The Persians were certainly something.
From every corner of the empire.
The Persians were certainly something. 300 is one of those movies you either really love or really hate. And I mean, hey, I love it. Flaws and all, it certainly has a style, and when things work, they really work well. It's got some problems for sure, but don't look at that. Don't look at it. For me, I was too young to watch 300 in theaters. The only thing I knew of it for years was that Sparta meme, and any vague ideas that came from cultural osmosis. I think for a while I knew more about 300 from Meet the Spartan trailers than the actual movie. Oh, as long as I know how to love, I know I'll stay alive. I was so disappointed when Mumble from Happy Feet didn't show up, or Baby Shrek, or a fucking Transformer. Leave Benny alone! It was actually the first rated R movie I'd ever seen. I watched it at a buddy of mine's house. It was one of the 4 things I still remember watching there. The other things were District 9, The Dark Knight, and that episode where Gus Fring dies in Breaking Bad. I had never seen Breaking Bad before. That was the first episode I had ever saw. He just put it on. So fuck you, Caleb. Anyway, 300. You know, I thought it was good. Honestly, the main thing it really did was just make me super interested in the ancient world. There was a lot of Spartan resurgence after this movie came out. Oh boy. I had never even given the period much thought before then. I mean, for a kid, what else was there for ancient Greece? Hercules? And at the end of the day, that's what any historical fiction is good for. Even the bad ones. Establishing a mood or energy that makes you just want to explore this time period even more. And then you do, and you realize, oh wow, Athens did some war crimes. And man, that first movie was some anti-Athens propaganda, I tell you what.
And if those philosophers and, boy lovers...
And I think a lot of people behind 300 realize how harshly the Athenians were treated.
Boy lovers.
And maybe even the Persians. Because 7 years later, we got a sequel.
For glory's sake.
Who here is actually gay?